In the first week of July 1947, a 31-year-old Army chaplain named Arthur Bowen was woken at 2:30 in the morning and driven across Roswell Army Airfield to the base hospital. He was told a man was dying and needed last rites. He was not told the man wasn't a man. Arthur Bowen lived another 51 years. He preached sermons, buried parishioners, baptized grandchildren, and in all that time, he told exactly one person what happened in that room. What the thing on the table said to him while he held its hand, that person was me. Why does a silence that long feel heavier than anything he actually said? Sit with me a while. I'm going to break mine. My name is Frank Delgado. 30 years in Air Force intelligence. I retired a colonel. In 1958, I signed papers like this twice. Once in March, once in October. Both times blind, before they'd tell me what they covered. That's how it worked back then. It was after the October one that they opened the folder. And I kept what was in that folder for 68 years. My wife died without ever hearing a word of it. Not one word in all the years we were married. Everyone who signed those papers is gone now. Every name on that distribution list except mine. So I'm going to tell it. I want to start not with the man, but with the moment, because the moment is what I can't shake all these decades later. The folder they showed me in 1958 contained, among other things, a typed debrief, 11 pages single-spaced, of Chaplain Captain Arthur Bowen, taken in July of 1947. Days after whatever came down outside Roswell, New Mexico. Years later, near the end of his life, I sat with the man himself, and he told me what the typed pages left out. I'm not going to embellish. I'm not going to speculate past what I read and what I heard. Where I'm sure, I'll tell you I'm sure. Where I'm guessing, I'll tell you I'm guessing. That's the deal. That's how I was trained, and I'm too old to work any other way. Let's begin. Let me tell you exactly what Bowen said he saw. Not the build-up, not the context, the moment itself. He's woken in his quarters by a lieutenant he doesn't recognize. It's the middle of the night, first week of July, 1947. The lieutenant says three things. There's a dying man, he's asking for a chaplain, and Bowen is not to speak to anyone on the way. Bowen grabs his kit, his Bible, his stole, a small vial of oil, and gets in a staff car. They don't take him to the main ward. They take him around the back of the base hospital, through a door with 2 armed guards on it, down a corridor, into a room that, by his description in the debrief, was an ordinary examination room that had been stripped. Furniture pushed out, blackout cloth over the one window, and flood lamps set up in the corners, bright. Too bright, he said, for a room where somebody was dying. And on the table, under a sheet pulled up to what would be the chest, was the patient. Now, here's how he described it in the 1947 debrief. And I'm quoting from memory, but it's the kind of thing memory holds on to. About the size of a 10-year-old child. Skin gray, with a texture he compared to candle wax. Not shiny, but like light went slightly into it before coming back out. A large head, out of proportion. Eyes closed, and he was grateful for that. He admitted it right there in the transcript, he said. I was grateful the eyes were closed. And then the detail. The one that convinced me, sitting in a secure room in 1958, that I was not reading fiction. Bowen said that under those flood lamps, 4 of them, 1 in each corner, the being cast no shadow he could find. He looked. He was a careful man, a man who noticed things, and he looked at the table, at the floor, and everything else in that room threw shadows the way it should. The IV stand, the sheet's folds, his own hands. But around the body itself, the light just arrived. He said it was like the light agreed not to argue with it. That detail, that specific, almost clinical observation, is the kind of thing that tends to stay with me. It's not the detail someone invents, it's the detail someone remembers. A liar gives you glowing eyes and a booming voice. A witness gives you a missing shadow that he double-checked because it bothered him. There was a medical officer in the room and one nurse. Bowen was told, flatly, that the patient was dying, that nothing more could be done, and that someone, he never learned who, had decided that no living thing on that base was going to die alone. Think about that. In the middle of the biggest secret in the world, somebody's first instinct was to call a chaplain. Bowen stepped to the table, and here's where the typed debrief gets thin. A few clipped sentences, and where what he told me 50 years later fills in. He said the hand came out from under the sheet before he reached for it, 4 fingers long. With a faint banding at each joint, he said, like the growth rings you'd see in a cut branch. Cool to the touch, but not cold, and it took his hand, took it deliberately, the way, in his words, a frightened parishioner takes your hand at a bedside, exactly the way I'd felt that grip 100 times. And then, he said, the room went quiet, in a way rooms don't go quiet, and the thing began to speak to him, not out loud, not in words. We'll get to what it said. I promise you we will get to what it said. But first you need to understand what happened to the time. Here is what the available evidence, fragmentary, imperfect, but persistent, suggests happened after Bowen took that hand. The folder I read in 1958 included copies of the hospital's night log. Access in and out of that back corridor was recorded. Of course it was. There were 2 armed guards on the door. Chaplain Bowen is logged in at 2:47 a.m. The medical officer's note, 1 paragraph initialed, no name typed under it, which itself is unusual, records that the patient ceased at 3:15 a.m. His word, ceased, not died, not expired, ceased. Bowen is logged out of that corridor at 6:52 a.m. Now do the math with me. 28 minutes from the time he enters to the time of death, and then 3 hours and 37 minutes before he walks out. Nearly 4 hours in a bright, stripped room with a body. When the debriefer asked him about it, and it's right there on page 8, they asked him directly, Bowen said, and I quote as close as I can, "I was in that room perhaps 20 minutes. I said a prayer over him when it was finished, and I left. 20 minutes. He believed it completely. The man had no reason to lie in a way that made him look worse. A chaplain lingering 4 hours in prayer would have been more flattering than a chaplain who lost the time entirely. And there's one more thing. Bowen wore a wristwatch, a wind-up, a gift from his wife. He mentioned it in the debrief because the debriefer asked him what time things happened. The watch had stopped. It read 3:14. The math says 4 hours. The man says 20 minutes. The watch says 3:14, and then nothing at all. That gap just sits there. It does not close when you look at it directly. I've been looking at it on and off for 68 years, and it has never closed 1 inch. I want to be careful here. A stopped watch proves nothing. Wind-up watches stop. Log clerks make errors. Frightened men misjudge time. Any one of these things alone I would dismiss. I was trained to dismiss them, but the deeper I went into the timeline, the more the small things started to cluster. And clusters in any investigation are the thing you can't afford to ignore. Item 1. The nurse. There was a nurse in that room. The debrief refers to her only as attending nurse, no name. Bowen told me, decades later, that she wept the entire time, silently, standing against the wall. Within 2 weeks of that night, per personnel movement records I was able to see fragments of much later. A nurse from that hospital was transferred out, not reassigned within the command, transferred clean off the continent. Alone, that proves nothing. Nurses get transferred. Item 2. The medical officer. The man who wrote, ceased. 11 days after that night, he's gone too. A lateral move to a posting that, when I tried to trace it in the 70s, didn't appear to have needed a medical officer at all. Alone proves nothing. Item 3, Bowen's own records. Every chaplain kept a service ledger, services performed, visits made, a running diary of the ministry. Bowen kept his meticulously. I've seen the surrounding months. The pages covering the first 10 days of July 1947 are missing. Not blank. Missing. Cut. Close to the binding by somebody with a straight edge and patience. Bowen swore to me he never cut them. Alone. That proves nothing. Pages get damaged, get removed for a dozen dull reasons. Item 4. And this is the one I keep coming back to. Bowen told me that for about 2 weeks afterward, the palm of his right hand, the hand that held the being's hand, carried a mark, not a burn, not a rash. He described it as a faint, dry, whitish patterning, geometric, like frost on a window, hexagonal, that no amount of washing touched, and that faded on its own. He never showed a doctor. He was too frightened to show a doctor. He showed his wife, and told her he'd touched some chemical. That's the only lie he ever told her, he said, and it ate at him for 50 years. Any one of these I'd throw out, all 4 of them, orbiting a single 28-minute window in a single room on a single night. The pattern repeats with a precision that is difficult to attribute to coincidence. And there's a 5th item, me. Because you should be asking, why was a second lieutenant, 1 year into the job, being read into an 11-year-old chaplain's debrief in 1958? Wrong rank for that folder. I knew it even then, and I asked. I was told my clearance covered the folder and my curiosity didn't. That's a direct quote, by the way. Your clearance covers the folder, Delgado. Your curiosity doesn't. I signed. I read. I kept my mouth shut for 68 years. Item 5. There's a difference between a silence and an absence. I want you to hold on to that distinction because it's the whole spine of this thing. An absence is when a record never existed. A silence is when a record existed and now somehow doesn't. Absences are boring. Silences are evidence. After I retired, I started pulling threads carefully through channels, the way a man with my background knows how to pull. I requested Bowen's service records. The reply, substantial portions destroyed in the 1973 fire at the Records Center in St. Louis. Now, that fire was real. It took out millions of files, and it's the single most convenient event in the history of American paperwork. Maybe his records burned. Millions did. Alone, it proves nothing. You know the refrain by now. I requested the base hospital's administrative records for July 1947. Reply, transferred to another custodian. Which custodian? Not retrievable at this time. I requested the debrief itself, the 11 pages I had held in my own hands in 1958, pages I could describe down to the typeface and the initials in the margin. The reply, and I want you to hear the exact language because the language is the tell. No record responsive to your request has been located. Not destroyed, not classified. Located. That's a lawyer's word. A destroyed record has a destruction certificate. A classified record gets you a denial with a control number. A record that cannot be located is a record that somebody moved off the books entirely, out of the indexed universe where no request can ever be responsive to anything. I filed variations of that request over a span of years. Different phrasings, different record groups, different agencies. 4 polite letters, 4 different signatures. The same nothing every time wearing slightly different clothes. I am not making a claim. I am asking a question. But the question, once asked, is very hard to put back down. Who curates an absence for 3/4 of a century? Because that's what this is, not neglect, curation. Somebody across generations of clerks and custodians kept that shelf empty. And an empty shelf, tended that carefully, tells you exactly one thing. What stood on it mattered. At some point during those minutes, those 20 minutes or 4 hours, take your pick. The being communicated something that Arthur Bowen spent the rest of his life attempting to translate, and this is the part that was not in the typed debrief. Not one line of it. He held it back from the debriefers in 1947, and he told me why. They asked me what it said. It didn't say. And I wasn't going to hand them a paraphrase of the most important thing that ever passed through me. He handed it to me instead, in 1998 in a hospice room. because by then he was dying, and I was the only living person who had read the file, and he wanted, in his words, one witness who'd believe the frame around the picture. Here's what he told me, as close to his words as my memory allows, and my memory has held very little else as tightly. He said the communication came the moment their hands closed, and it came the way a chord comes. That was his comparison. He was a musical man, played the chapel organ. Not one note after another like speech, all the notes at once, like a chord, meaning arriving whole, and his mind spending the rest of his life picking out the individual notes. The first thing in the chord was this: it was not afraid. And more than that, it was aware that he was afraid on its behalf, and it was, Bowen's word, amused gently. The way an old man is amused when a child worries the sun won't come back up after it sets. The second thing was harder for him to render, and he tried on it for 50 years, the being communicated that from where it stood, where its kind stood, dying was not an ending but a change of, and here Bowen struggled every single time he told it, a change of adjacency. That's the word he settled on late in life. Adjacency. He said, imagine a single note held on the organ. When I lift my finger, you'd say the note died. But the note was never separate to begin with. It was the pipe and the air and the room. Lifting the finger doesn't destroy the note. It returns it to the room it was always part of. It stops being next to things and goes back to being among them. Adjacency. I have turned that word over in my mind many times. Many times. On the night my wife passed, I sat in the hallway of the hospital and I turned it over until sunrise. In the third note in the chord, the one Bowen only told me at the very end when the nurses had gone out and his voice was down to almost nothing, was a single concept aimed directly at him, at humanity through him. He rendered it as one word. He said the being pressed into him with what he described as unbearable tenderness, tenderness that hurt, like sun on a cold hand. The understanding that nothing that has ever happened is lost, that every moment is kept, not remembered the way we remember, thinly, with decay. Kept, held whole, somewhere the being regarded as no more mysterious than we regard a filing cabinet, and that its own death, right then, on that table, under those flood lamps, in the hands of a terrified 31-year-old Methodist chaplain, was already kept, was already safe. Had in some sense, Bowen said he could feel, but never once managed to say, already always been safe, not saved, kept. He was very firm about that, not saved, kept. 9 years after Bowen died, a woman at a kitchen table in Kearney, Nebraska, handed me the same word. She got it from a different hand in a different decade in a storm cellar her father never opened. 2 witnesses, no connection between them, one word. And then, he told me, it did the thing that broke him for life. It squeezed his hand, twice, weak, deliberate. The universal, wordless bedside signal, and the one every chaplain and every nurse and every widow on this earth knows in their bones. I know you're here. Thank you for staying. And then his watch read 3:14. And the medical officer wrote, ceased, and 4 hours went somewhere neither of us has ever been able to find. Once you see it, you cannot unsee it. And Bowen is not unique. That's the part that keeps me up now at my age, when sleep is supposed to come easy, because there's so little left to guard. Because in 30 years inside the intelligence world, in corridors and safe houses and end-of-tour drinks where men said one sentence more than they meant to, I heard the shape of this story more than once, never the same details, always the same shape, somebody dying that shouldn't have existed, somebody ordinary, a medic, a nurse, a padre, never the generals, always the ones whose job is hands and comfort, brought in at the last hour, a communication that arrives whole like a cord, and afterward the missing hours, the transferred witnesses, the shelf swept clean. I know of at least 2 other men who carried a piece of this. Both were on that 1958 distribution list. One of them in the 80s started making noises about writing his memoirs. He was dead within the year. Heart, they said. And maybe it was. He was no young man. The other simply stopped answering my letters around 1991, and when I finally tracked down his daughter, she told me his papers had been collected. Her word, collected, by men she assumed were from his old office 3 days after the funeral, before the family had even opened his desk. Alone, each proves nothing. Say it with me by now. Old men die. Offices collect papers. But the clusters are the thing you can't afford to ignore. So here's where I've landed, after 68 years of carrying this. Whatever came down outside Roswell in July of 1947, the machinery around it did what machinery does, classified, transferred, curated the empty shelves. But the message, the actual content of that night, didn't pass through the machinery at all. It passed through one frightened chaplain's right hand. The most important communication in human history, if it was what it appeared to be, was delivered person to person, palm to palm, and it said, "You are kept. All of it is kept. Even this." And I can't stop asking, why him? Why a chaplain? Why the one man in that building whose entire job was to sit with the dying and hold on? Unless the being knew exactly whose hand it was reaching for, unless it chose. Bowen thought it chose. He told me so, at the very end in that hospice room. His voice was nearly gone. He pulled me down close and he said, "Frank, it wasn't dying and I happened to be there. I was there because it was dying. It waited for me. It had one more thing to give, and it needed hands like mine to give it to. And I asked him. I had to ask him. What the one more thing was, whether kept was the whole of it, or whether there was something else, something he was still holding back even then, even from me." And he smiled. First smile I'd seen on him in 3 days. And he said, "There was one more note in the cord, Frank, about what's coming. I've been waiting 50 years to see if I'd have to say it out loud. I've thought about that sentence every day since 1998. Every single day. My wife died without hearing any of this. The signers are all gone. It's just me now and whatever's left of my time and that last note in the cord." He leaned closer. His hand took mine. Twice, weak, deliberate, and then he